The day Winifred Sawyer arrived in Dust Creek, Nevada, the sky was the color of a bruise, and every man in town stopped what he was doing to watch her climb down from the stagecoach with her chin raised like she owned the whole of the frontier. She did not own anything, of course. She had $43 sewn into the hem of her skirt, a leather trunk with a broken latch, and a letter from a man named Douglas Prout who had promised her work as a seamstress in his dry goods store. She was 24 years old, she had buried her mother in Missouri 6 months prior, and she had decided, with the fierce and quiet determination that defined everything she did, that she would not spend another winter in a house full of grief and borrowed money. Dust Creek was not what she had expected. She had expected something modest, perhaps a town working toward respectability. What she found instead was a single wide street packed with mud, a saloon that appeared to be the most structurally sound building in the entire settlement, a blacksmith shop whose chimney never stopped smoking, and a sheriff's office that looked like it had survived at least 2 fires. The year was 1874, and the Nevada frontier was still raw in all the ways that mattered. The first person she encountered after stepping off the stagecoach was a boy of about 12 who tried to sell her a rabbit he was carrying by the ears. She declined politely and asked him where she might find Douglas Prout's dry goods store. The boy pointed down the street and then added without much ceremony that Mr. Prout had died of a fever 3 weeks ago. Winifred stood very still for a moment. The wind came down off the mountains and pulled at the loose strands of her dark brown hair. She looked down at the letter in her hand, at the careful script that had promised her wages and a room above the store, and a fresh start in a place where no one knew her name or her loss, and then she folded it once, twice, and tucked it into her coat pocket. She picked up her trunk by its broken latch and walked down the street. The dry goods store was being run, somewhat chaotically, by a woman named Marta Hensley, who was Prout's niece and who had ridden in from Reno to sort out his affairs. Marta was a stout woman in her late 40s with red hands and a no-nonsense manner, and she looked Winifred over from boots to hat brim before saying that she had no use for a seamstress because she intended to sell the store within the month. It was not, by any measure, a promising start. Winifred thanked her and went next door to the saloon, not to drink, but because saloons in frontier towns were often the best source of information about employment. She pushed through the swinging doors with the same lifted chin she had worn off the stagecoach and asked the barman, a heavy-set fellow with suspicious eyes, whether he knew of anyone in town who needed skilled hands. He studied her for a long moment, then jerked his head toward the far corner of the room. There was a man sitting there alone at a table near the window, nursing a cup of coffee and reading what appeared to be a surveying map spread wide across the table in front of him. He had dark, sun-weathered skin, a jaw that had not seen a razor in several days, and the kind of broad shoulders that came from years of hard physical labor rather than display. He wore a battered brown hat pushed back on his head, and his boots, though worn at the heel, were clean. He was perhaps 28 or 29 years old, and there was something about the way he sat, utterly still and entirely focused on what was in front of him, that made Winifred think immediately that he was a man who did not waste anything, not movement, not words, not attention. That was Abel Shelby. She walked over to his table and stood there until he looked up. His eyes were dark and patient and a little guarded, the way men's eyes often were in places where the wrong word could mean serious trouble. "Excuse me," she said. "The barman suggested you might know of work available in this town." Abel Shelby looked at her for a moment, then at the barman, who was industriously wiping down the bar and very deliberately not watching them. "What kind of work?" Abel asked. His voice was low and even, with the faint trace of a southern accent that had been mostly worn away by years on the trail. "I sew," she said. "I keep books. I can cook plain food well and fancy food adequately. I am reliable and I do not complain, and I am looking for honest employment." He studied her for another moment, not in the way some men did, as though measuring her for something she had not agreed to, but in the way a careful person assessed a situation before committing to an answer. Then he pulled out the chair across from him and nodded at it. She sat. His name was Abel Shelby, he told her, and he ran a small cattle operation about 6 miles east of town, up along a creek that fed down from the Ruby Mountains. He had 1,200 acres, 140 head of cattle, and a ranch house that was, he admitted without embarrassment, in a state of considerable disorder because his housekeeper had left 3 months ago to go live with her daughter in Sacramento, and he had not yet found a replacement. "I need someone who can manage the house and keep the books for the operation," he said. "The cattle work I handle myself along with 2 ranch hands. But the domestic side of things has gone entirely to ruin." "Do you have a wife?" Winifred asked because it was a practical question and she had learned not to leave practical questions unasked. "No," he said simply. "Then I would need a proper room and proper wages," she said, "and the understanding that my time is my own on Sundays." "Agreed," he said. She put her hand across the table. He shook it, and that was how Winifred Sawyer came to work for Abel Shelby. The ride out to the ranch that first afternoon was made in relative silence. Abel drove a wagon pulled by a gray horse named Conductor, and Winifred sat beside him on the bench with her broken-latched trunk secured in the wagon bed. The landscape was vast and copper-colored in the late autumn light, and the mountains to the east were already wearing their first thin coat of snow near the peaks. Winifred watched all of it with the careful attention she gave to everything new, filing it away, learning its character. Abel pointed out landmarks as they went, not because he was a talkative man, but because, she would come to understand, he believed in giving a person the information they needed to orient themselves. The creek was called Pinyon Creek. The ridge to the northeast was where he had lost 4 head to a mountain lion the previous spring. The cluster of cottonwood trees in the middle distance marked the edge of his property. The ranch house was, as promised, a disaster. It was a solidly built structure of wood and stone, 2 stories, with a covered porch that ran across the front and a kitchen lean-to attached to the back. But the inside was the evidence of a man living alone and refusing to acknowledge it. Dishes were stacked in a precarious tower near the dry sink. 2 saddles were draped over the back of the kitchen chairs. A pile of mending had been left in the center of the main room so long that a spider had begun to build a web in it. Winifred stood in the doorway and took stock of all of it without saying a word. Then she set down her trunk, removed her coat, rolled up her sleeves, and got to work. Abel stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her for a moment with an expression she could not quite read. Then he put his hat back on and went out to see to the horses. In the weeks that followed, a rhythm established itself between them that was practical and comfortable and, on Winifred's part at least, carefully maintained at a professional distance. She rose before dawn to start the stove and have breakfast ready when Abel and his 2 ranch hands, brothers named Cal and Pete Dunning, came in from the morning feeding. She kept the books with the methodical neatness that her mother had taught her, recording every purchase and sale and outstanding debt in a ledger that had previously been used as a sort of general dumping ground for scraps of paper. She mended the pile in the sitting room. She organized the supply cupboards. She wrote letters to cattlemen in Elko on Abel's behalf when he needed to negotiate prices. She was efficient and capable, and she kept the whole operation running more smoothly than it had in years, and Abel knew it and said so, not with excessive praise but with the straightforward acknowledgement of a man who noticed what was done well. She noticed things about him in return. He was fair with his ranch hands, paying them on time and treating them with respect. He was patient with the horses in a way that revealed something generous in his character. On the one occasion when she watched him doctor a calf that had been injured on the fence line, crouched in the cold mud for an hour working with careful hands, she felt something shift quietly in her chest that she did not immediately identify. There was a problem, though, and it had a name. His name was Vance Holloway. Holloway was a land speculator from Sacramento who had been moving through the Nevada territory for 2 years, buying up ranch land from struggling operations, and consolidating it into large parcels that he then sold to mining interests. He was a well-dressed man with cold blue eyes and a manner so polished it functioned almost like a weapon. And he wanted Abel's land badly because Pinyon Creek was one of the few reliable water sources in a 30-mile radius. He had come to the ranch twice before Winifred's arrival, making offers that Abel had refused. He came a third time on a gray November morning, arriving in a smart black buggy with a man who appeared to function as both assistant and warning. Winifred was on the porch hanging laundry when the buggy pulled into the yard. She watched Holloway step down and straighten his coat and look up at the house with the proprietary expression of a man who had already decided something was his. She went inside and found Abel at the kitchen table. "There is a man named Holloway in your yard," she said. Abel's face went very still in a way she had come to recognize as the expression he wore when something required his full attention. He rose from the table and went to the door. The conversation between the two men took place on the porch, and Winifred did not eavesdrop on principle, but the kitchen window was open and the voices carried. Holloway's offer had gone up considerably since his last visit. He was now offering 3 times what the land was worth by any reasonable measure, and he framed it as generosity, as doing Abel a favor, as removing the difficulty of running a cattle operation alone in a territory that was changing fast. Abel's response was brief and final. The land was not for sale. It had never been for sale. He would appreciate it if Holloway would stop making the drive out here. Holloway's voice changed then, losing just enough of its polish to reveal what was underneath. He said that things could become difficult for a man who refused to see which way the territory was moving. He said it in the reasonable tone of a man stating a fact, which made it worse. Abel said good morning and went inside and closed the door. He stood in the kitchen for a moment and then looked at Winifred, who was standing at the stove with her back carefully turned. "He has been trying to buy this land for 2 years, Abel said. "I heard," she said. She turned around. "Is he dangerous?" Abel considered the question honestly. "He has money and connections and no particular conscience," he said. "That combination is usually more dangerous than a man with a gun." She nodded slowly. "Then we should make sure the books are absolutely airtight," she said, "and that every deed and title is in good order. A man with money and connections tends to look for the paper vulnerabilities first." Abel looked at her for a long moment. "That is a very clear-headed way to think about it," he said. "My father lost a farm in Kentucky to a man very much like that," she said simply. "He found a lien that my father had forgotten about. I will not let that happen here." She did not say here, in the sense of her home, precisely, but something in the word hung between them for a moment before she turned back to the stove. She spent 3 days going through every piece of paper related to the ranch. She found the deed, the original water rights filing, the cattle registration records, the records of every loan Abel had taken and paid back. She organized it all and made a second copy of every critical document in her own hand. And she stored those copies in the leather satchel she had brought from Missouri, which she kept under her bed. Abel watched her work with an expression that was somewhere between gratitude and something else, something quieter and harder to name. "You do not have to do all this," he said one evening when she was still at the table at 9 o'clock, copying out a water rights document by lamplight. "I know," she said, without looking up. He stood there for a moment and then he said quietly, "Thank you, Winifred." It was the first time he had used her given name. She felt the small deliberateness of it and kept her eyes on the page so he would not see what it did to her face. "You are welcome," she said. "Good night, Abel." He went to bed, and she finished the document, and she sat for a moment in the lamplight afterward thinking about the way her name had sounded in his voice, low and careful, like something he had thought about before saying. December arrived with serious intent, blowing down from the Ruby Mountains in long, cold sweeps. The cattle were moved to the winter pasture, which was sheltered by a natural ridge to the north, and the ranch operation slowed to the deliberate pace of winter maintenance. Cal and Pete Dunning went to spend Christmas with their family in Elko, leaving Abel and Winifred alone on the ranch for 10 days. It was not uncomfortable, exactly, but it was charged in a way that the presence of the Dunning brothers had kept at a manageable level. There were only 2 of them now, and the house, which was substantial for a frontier ranch, had the feeling of being slightly smaller than it had been before. They fell into new rhythms. Abel taught her to play cribbage, and she beat him so decisively on the 3rd night that he looked at her with genuine surprise, and she laughed outright for the first time since arriving in Dust Creek. A real laugh, unguarded and bright, and the sound of it did something visible to his face, softened it in a way he did not try to hide quickly enough. She showed him that she could identify every constellation visible from the porch on a clear night, something her father had taught her in Kentucky before everything went wrong, and he stood beside her in the cold dark and listened to the names with his breath making small clouds in the night air, and she was acutely aware of how close they were standing. On Christmas Eve, she made a proper dinner from the supplies that had been laid in, roasted a chicken she had been fattening for 2 weeks, made cornbread and a dried apple pie, and set the table with the 2 good plates she had discovered in the back of a cupboard. Abel came in from the evening rounds to find the house warm and smelling of food, and she had taken down and dusted off his mother's candlesticks, which she had found wrapped in cloth at the back of the linen cupboard. He stopped in the doorway. She turned from the stove and saw his face and was immediately worried that she had overstepped. "I found them in the linen cupboard," she said quickly. "I hope it is all right. I thought, for Christmas," she stopped. He came into the room properly and looked at the candlesticks on the table, and his face did something complicated and private that she looked away from because it felt like something she was not supposed to see. "They were my mother's," he said. "She died when I was 11. I have never taken them out since." "I am sorry," she said. "I can put them back." "No," he said. He looked up at her. "No, please, leave them." They ate dinner together by candlelight, and the conversation found its way to places it had not been before. He told her about growing up in Georgia, the son of a small farmer who had been ruined by the war, about the years he had spent drifting west as a young man with next to nothing, about how he had homesteaded this land at 22 with 2 horses and a determination to build something that would not be taken from him. She told him about Kentucky, about her father's farm and its loss, about her mother's long illness, about the years of careful saving and the plan she had made to reinvent herself in the West. They were 2 people who had both lost things and rebuilt themselves around what remained, and recognizing that in each other created a kind of warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the stove. After dinner, he helped her clear the table, which he had never done before, and when they both reached for the same plate at the same moment, their hands touched, and neither of them pulled away immediately. They stood very still for what was probably only 3 seconds but felt considerably longer. Then Winifred stepped back and Abel took the plate to the dry sink, and they said good night with a formality that was slightly more careful than usual, and she lay in her room for a long time listening to the wind and thinking about the warmth of his hand. January brought trouble. It began with a fence. 400 yards of the fence on the eastern boundary of Abel's property was cut, clean and deliberate, on a Sunday night. When Abel and Cal rode out to assess it Monday morning, they found it had been pushed down into Pinyon Creek, which ran along that boundary, partially diverting the water flow. Abel rode into Dust Creek and spoke to the sheriff, a man named Hector Gaines who was generally competent and generally honest, and was, in this instance, genuinely concerned. Gaines came out to look at the damage and agreed it was not accidental. He said he would ask around. In town that afternoon, Winifred was at the general store, which had been sold by Marta Hensley to a couple named Ford who were efficiently returning it to working order, when she overheard 2 men talking at the far end of the counter. One of them said that Holloway had hired himself a new man, a fellow named Briggs who had previously worked in Sacramento doing things that were not entirely above board for a mining company up there. She bought her supplies, thanked the Fords, and drove back to the ranch. She told Abel what she had heard that evening. He listened without interruption, then sat quietly for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "A man with money and connections," he said, and looked at her. "And now a man who does things that are not entirely above board," she said. They looked at each other across the kitchen table, and in that look was the understanding that this had become something more serious than a business dispute. "I want you to know," Abel said carefully, "that if you wanted to go back to Dust Creek and find work there, I would understand it. This is not your trouble." She held his gaze steadily. "I do not see it that way," she said. "Winifred, I have copies of every document that relates to this land," she said. "Your deed, your water rights, your property tax records, your cattle registration. If Holloway tries to find a paper vulnerability, he will not find one because I have already closed every one. And I intend to keep doing so." She paused. "This is my work. This is what you hired me for. I am not leaving." Abel looked at her for a long moment, and there was something in his eyes that went beyond gratitude, something deeper and more private that he did not put into words. "All right," he said quietly. "Thank you." "Stop thanking me," she said, "and fix the fence." He smiled at that. It was a rare thing, Abel's full smile, not the small restrained curve he usually allowed himself, but a real one, and it changed his whole face, made it younger and warmer and so startlingly handsome that she had to look down at her ledger to compose herself. The fence was repaired. 2 weeks later, a section of the barn roof was damaged in what Abel's neighbor, a rancher named Jim Corbett who ran land about 4 miles to the south, confirmed was not consistent with weather damage. Someone had been up there. Winifred went to work. She wrote a letter to the county land office in Elko, requesting a certified copy of Abel's deed and water rights filings, which she planned to have registered with the territorial government in Carson City as an additional layer of protection. She wrote a letter to a lawyer in Elko named Henry Foss, whose name she had found in a newspaper and who was described as having experience in property law, explaining the situation and asking for a consultation. Abel took the letters to town himself, and when he came back he told her that while he was at the post office, he had spoken to Holloway directly. He had found him coming out of the bank. "What did he say?" Winifred asked. "He said that accidents happen on remote properties," Abel said. "He said it with a very pleasant expression. And you?" "I told him that I kept excellent records and that I had a very thorough bookkeeper." He looked at her. "He asked who my bookkeeper was." "I did not tell him." She felt a small chill at that. "Good," she said. Henry Foss, the lawyer, wrote back within the week. He confirmed that Abel's title was sound, that his water rights were properly filed and registered, and that the most likely avenue Holloway would try was either fabricating a competing claim or finding a way to make the operation economically unviable. He advised against any action that could be construed as threatening and recommended keeping meticulous records of every incident. Winifred was already doing that. She had started a second ledger, a private one, in which she recorded the date, description, and any witnesses to every suspicious event on the property. She wrote it in the same neat hand she used for the account books with the same careful precision. Abel found her writing in it one evening and read over her shoulder. He was quiet for a moment after he finished. "You are building a legal record," he said. "I am building an evidence file," she said. "If Holloway ever does something we can bring before a judge, we will have everything we need." He put his hand on her shoulder briefly, just a moment. "What would I do without you?" he said, so quietly she was not sure at first she had heard it correctly. She looked up at him. He was looking at her with that expression again, the one that was not gratitude but something much closer and more dangerous to both of them. She said, with more steadiness than she felt, "Hopefully you will not have to find out." He let his hand drop and moved away, and the kitchen settled back into its ordinary warmth, but the air between them felt like it had changed slightly, the way air changes before a storm. February. A letter arrived from the territorial capital that threw everything sideways. It was addressed to Abel Shelby, and it was from the office of the territorial surveyor. It stated in official language that a competing survey had been filed by a party named the Nevada Land and Water Development Company, which claimed that the original survey establishing Abel's eastern boundary had contained an error of approximately 60 yards, placing Pinyon Creek and the water rights associated with it outside his legal property. Abel read the letter at the kitchen table while Winifred stood behind him reading over his shoulder. She read it twice. "That is Holloway," she said. "He has incorporated a company to file the survey challenge." "Can he do that?" Abel asked. "He can file it," she said. "Whether it stands is a different matter." She was already thinking fast. "The original survey, do you have the surveyor's field notes? Not just the recorded plat, but the actual field notes, the measurements, the reference points?" Abel looked at her. "I do not know. They might be in the trunk in the barn loft. I have papers out there I have never gone through properly." "We need to find them tonight," she said. They spent 2 hours in the barn loft by lantern light, going through a battered trunk that contained the accumulated paper history of the property since Abel had first homesteaded it. Abel pulled things out and handed them to Winifred, who sorted them with quick, practiced efficiency. She found the field notes at the bottom of the trunk, wrapped in oilcloth. She sat cross-legged on the loft floor with the lantern beside her and read through them carefully. Abel sat nearby, watching her face. "The original surveyor used a permanent natural reference point," she said. "He used a specific rock formation at the edge of the creek which he described in detail. If that formation still exists, it proves the original survey was correct." She looked up. "Do you know the formation he is describing?" "He calls it a double-spire granite outcropping near the eastern bank." Abel thought for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. "I know exactly where that is," he said. "I have ridden past it 1,000 times. It is right where the fence crosses the creek." "Then we need a surveyor," she said. "An independent one from outside the territory if possible, one with no connection to Holloway or his company." She wrote to Henry Foss in Elko that same night, explaining what they had found and requesting a recommendation for a reputable independent surveyor, and also asking him to file an immediate objection to the competing survey claim on the grounds that it was procedurally premature and likely fraudulent. While they waited, which required more patience than either of them found comfortable, life on the ranch continued in its rhythms. The cattle needed attending, the books needed keeping, the kitchen needed running, but there was a tension now that settled over everything like a layer of dust, a constant awareness that something was in motion against them and that they were working to stay ahead of it. It drew them together in the way that shared danger and shared purpose tend to do. They talked more in the evenings. Not just about the land dispute, but about everything else, about the books they had read, about their ideas for the ranch, about the territories and the country, and what the future of the West would look like now that the railroad had come through and the old frontier ways were changing. Abel was, she discovered, a reader and a thinker who had largely kept those things to himself because there had been no one around who was interested. Winifred was deeply interested. "You should expand the herd," she told him one evening, looking at the numbers in the account ledger. "The operation has more carrying capacity than you are using. If you increased the herd to 200 head and brought on one more ranch hand for the summer season, you would increase your net profit by nearly 40%. He leaned over the table to look at the figures she was pointing to. They were very close together in the lamplight, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "Where would the extra pasture come from?" he asked. "The northern section," she said. "You have been leaving it fallow for 2 years. The grass is fully recovered, you told me yourself." "I did," he said. He was looking at the figures, but she had the distinct impression his attention was not entirely on them. "Abel," she said. "Yes," he said, still looking at the page. "Are you actually reading those numbers?" A pause. "No," he admitted. She looked up. He was already looking at her. They were close enough that she could see the precise color of his eyes in the lamplight, brown with a ring of amber near the center. He did not look away, and neither did she. and the kitchen was very quiet except for the fire and the wind outside. "Winifred," he said, and there was something in the way he said her name that made it entirely different from all the other times, something deliberate and careful and full. "Abel," she said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "I think," he said slowly, as if he were measuring each word before he released it, "that I have been trying very hard to think of you only as an employee." "I know," she said quietly. "It is not working," he said. "I know that too," she said. They looked at each other for a moment longer, and then he reached up and very slowly, with a patience that was characteristic of everything he did, tucked a loose strand of her hair back from her face. His fingers brushed her cheek, and she felt the touch everywhere. "I do not want to make things difficult for you," he said. "This is your work and your livelihood, and I would not want you to feel able," she said. "You are not making things difficult." He was looking at her with such careful attention, such earnest concern for her that something in her chest ached with it. "Are you certain?" he asked. "I have been certain for some time," she said. "I have been waiting for you to catch up." Something broke open in his expression then, something warm and a little undone, and he laughed softly, a real laugh, private and surprised, and it was so unexpectedly beautiful that she reached up and put her hand against his jaw before she had consciously decided to. He turned his face into her palm and closed his eyes for just a moment, like a man taking a long drink of water after a dry stretch of road. Then he opened his eyes and looked at her and said, "I am entirely caught up now." She smiled at him. "Good," she said. He kissed her very gently, tentatively, like a question rather than a statement, and then she kissed him back and answered the question thoroughly, and the ledger with its careful numbers was entirely forgotten for the rest of the evening. March came in bright and cold, and with it came Henry Foss's reply. He had retained an independent surveyor named Thomas Carver out of San Francisco, a man with an impeccable reputation and no connections to Nevada land interests. Carver would arrive in Dust Creek in 2 weeks. He also reported that Holloway's company had managed to get a preliminary injunction from a sympathetic judge in Carson City that technically froze any improvements to Abel's eastern boundary until the survey dispute was resolved. It was purely a harassment tactic, Foss said, designed to inconvenience and intimidate rather than to succeed legally, but it was real while it lasted. Abel took the news calmly. He was, Winifred had come to understand, a man who dealt with adversity by becoming quieter and more focused rather than louder and more agitated. But she saw the strain in the set of his jaw and the way his hands tightened briefly around his coffee cup. She covered his hand with hers. He looked down at it, then up at her, and the strain eased slightly. "We have everything we need to beat this," she said. "I know," he said. "Foss is good, Carver will do the survey, the field notes are documented, our evidence file is complete. And we have each other," she said. He turned his hand over and held hers. "That is the most important part," he said. She had not expected him to say it quite so directly, and it surprised a blush out of her that she had not managed since she was 16. He noticed, and his mouth curved in that rare full smile. "Do not look so surprised," he said. "I am catching up quickly." "You are," she agreed. Thomas Carver arrived on a Tuesday, a lean, precise man in his mid-50s, who moved with the efficiency of someone who had spent decades in the field and had no patience for anything unnecessary. He spent 2 days surveying the eastern boundary, running measurements, consulting the original field notes, and recording everything in his own documentation with a thoroughness that was evident to anyone watching. On the afternoon of the second day, he came to the ranch house and sat at the kitchen table and told Abel and Winifred with no preamble that the original survey was correct to within 2 feet and that the competing claim was based on measurements that were either incompetent or deliberately falsified. He would say so in a sworn affidavit. Abel looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up. "Thank you," he said. "Thank your bookkeeper," Carver said dryly, nodding at Winifred. Finding those field notes and having the sense to understand what they meant was the thing that mattered. Without them, it would have been difficult. He filed his report with the county surveyor's office in Elko and sent copies to the territorial government in Carson City and to Henry Foss, along with a sworn statement about the methodological inconsistencies in the competing survey. Foss presented the material to the court in Carson City 3 weeks later. The injunction was lifted. The competing survey was dismissed. A formal inquiry was opened into the Nevada Land and Water Development Company. It was not precisely over, because Holloway was a man with resources and no particular conscience, and men like that did not give up easily. But the legal threat was defeated, and the most dangerous angle of attack had been closed. The news reached them in a letter from Foss on a warm April evening, when the cottonwoods along the creek were just beginning to show their first pale green. Abel read the letter on the porch and then sat very still for a moment with it in his hands, looking out over his land, the land he had built from nothing and fought to keep, and which was still, unquestionably, his. Winifred came out and stood beside him and read over his shoulder, and then straightened up and looked at the view he was looking at, the wide Nevada Valley with the mountains in the distance and Pinon Creek glinting in the evening light. "It is beautiful," she said. "I know," he said. He looked up at her. "I forget to notice sometimes because I am always looking at what needs to be done, but it is." "It is," she agreed. He reached out and took her hand where it rested on the porch railing beside his. She looked down at their joined hands and felt something settle in her, something that had been in motion since Missouri and maybe before that, some restlessness and grief and uncertainty that had been driving her forward, finally settling into stillness. "I want to ask you something," Abel said. "All right," she said. He stood up from the porch chair and turned to face her, and there was something in his expression so serious and so open at the same time that her heart turned over in her chest. "I know this is not how these things are supposed to be done," he said. "I know I should have planned something better than the front porch on a Tuesday in April. Abel, I am in love with you," he said. It came out plain and direct and entirely unembellished, the way he said everything that mattered to him. "I have been in love with you since sometime in December, and I have been a considerable fool about saying so, and I would like you to stay, not as my employee, as my wife." He paused. "If you want to." She looked at him for a moment, this man who had built something real and good from nothing, and who defended it with patience and intelligence, and who had looked at his mother's candlesticks with an expression she had been privileged to witness, and she felt the full weight of what she was about to say. "Yes," she said. "Of course, yes." He exhaled like a man who has been holding a breath for a long time, and then he pulled her into his arms and held her, not dramatically, but with the steady certainty of a man who had found what he had been looking for and intended to keep it carefully. She put her arms around him and felt the solid warmth of him and the mountain wind in her hair and the distant sound of cattle and the creek, and she thought that it was, by every possible measure, enough. They were married in May. The ceremony was performed by the justice of the peace in Dusk Creek, a man named Aldrich who had been a minister before he was a justice and who read the words with genuine feeling. Marta Hensley, who had stayed in Dusk Creek after all and had taken over the management of a boarding house, came and wept in the cheerful way of a woman who enjoys a wedding. Cal and Pete Dunning wore their good shirts and looked profoundly uncomfortable and genuinely happy. Jim Corbett, Abel's neighboring rancher, attended with his wife, a capable woman named Susan, and the four of them had become true friends over the winter months when the land trouble had drawn the neighboring ranches into common cause. Winifred wore the best dress she owned, a deep blue wool that her mother had helped her sew in Missouri, and she had pressed it the night before with the heavy iron she had heated on the stove until it was perfect. She carried a small bundle of wildflowers that she had gathered herself from the hillside above the ranch that morning. Abel, when he saw her come through the door of the justice's office, went perfectly still for a moment in the way she had come to love, the way he went still when something had his complete attention. Then he smiled, the full real smile, and she smiled back with everything she had. The words were simple and honest, and they meant every one of them. Afterward, Susan Corbett organized a supper at the ranch that was, by any frontier standard, a remarkable occasion. There was roasted meat and cornbread, and 2 kinds of pie and a great deal of good coffee, and Pete Dunning, who played the harmonica with more enthusiasm than skill, provided music that nonetheless worked perfectly well for dancing on the cleared porch floor. Abel danced with her, which she had not expected, because he did not seem like a man who danced. He was not an elegant dancer, but he was deliberate and careful, and he held her properly, and she danced in the Nevada dusk with the mountains in the distance and her husband's hand warm at her waist, and she was happy in a way that felt substantial and real, not the light, quick happiness of a momentary pleasure, but something structural, something she could build on. Jim Corbett danced with Susan, and Cal and Pete took turns dancing with Marta Hensley, who was a surprisingly nimble dancer for a woman of her dimensions, and who thoroughly enjoyed the attention. The evening stretched long into the warm spring night, and when everyone finally went home and the porch was quiet again, Winifred and Abel stood side by side looking out at the dark shape of the land. "Well," Abel said. "Well," she agreed. He looked at her sideways. "Are you going to tell me what is next?" She laughed. "I have several ideas about improving the north pasture drainage," she said. "Of course you do," he said with great affection. He put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and they stood together in the quiet of their land while the stars came out over the Ruby Mountains. The summer that followed was the best working season the ranch had seen in years. Winifred's plan to expand the herd moved forward. Abel bought 60 additional head at a cattle sale in Elko in June, bringing the total to just over 200, and hired a third ranch hand, a steady young man named Thomas Alves, who had recently arrived from Texas and who proved to be a fine hand with horses as well as cattle. The north pasture drainage, which Winifred had diagnosed correctly as inadequate, was improved by redirecting a secondary feeder channel from the creek, and the grass came in thick and good. The account books reflected the change with the satisfying clarity of numbers that are moving in the right direction. Winifred kept them as carefully as she always had, but there was a difference now, a warmth in the accounting that came from knowing that what she was building and protecting was also hers. Holloway was quieter now. The inquiry in Carson City had not resulted in criminal charges, which was frustrating but not surprising given his connections, but it had been publicly embarrassing and had cost him the backing of at least one of his Eastern investors. He had moved his attentions to a different part of the territory, or so they heard from Jim Corbett, who had his own network of information. Abel did not let his guard down entirely, because he was too careful a man to assume that a quiet enemy was a gone enemy, but the daily tension of the winter eased considerably. In the evenings, they had time for each other in ways they had not before, time that was not stolen from exhaustion or shaped by worry. Abel was building bookshelves in the sitting room, which he had planned for years and never gotten to, and Winifred was writing to a cousin in Ohio to send the books she had left behind when she came west. They were making the house into something more clearly a home. She noticed the small ways he showed his love, because he was not a demonstrative man by nature and his gestures were quiet. He left her coffee on the table before she came down in the mornings. When she went to town for supplies, he unhitched the wagon and put the horse away before she had even gotten the boxes inside. When she was working late at the books, he came and sat in the same room and read, not to interrupt her but to be with her. She showed hers differently. She learned from Jim Corbett's wife Susan that Abel's favorite food was an apple cake that his mother had made, and she spent an afternoon in November getting it right, following a recipe Susan had found in a cookbook she had brought from Virginia, adjusting it twice before it was what she imagined it should be. She left it on the table when he came in from the evening rounds. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the cake and then at her and then back at the cake, and she saw the same complicated private thing in his face that she had seen when she took out his mother's candlesticks on Christmas Eve. "How did you know?" he asked. "Susan told me," she said. "Sit down and have some." He sat down and ate a large piece of it in a silence that was not comfortable so much as full, and then he reached across the table and covered her hand with his and just held it for a moment without saying anything, which was, she had come to understand, the most direct expression of feeling he had. That winter, she realized she was going to have a baby. She told him on a quiet Sunday morning in January, sitting across the breakfast table from him. She said it plainly, because that was how they talked to each other about important things. He was still for a moment, the complete stillness that was his deepest form of attention, and then something crossed his face that she had never seen there before, something that was wonder and fear and joy all at once, enormous and unguarded. "A baby," he said. "In July, I think," she said. "Perhaps early August." He got up from his chair and came around the table and crouched down beside her chair so they were at eye level and took both her hands in his. He looked at her for a long moment with that unguarded wonder still on his face. "Are you well?" he asked, because that was what he asked first. "I am very well," she said. She squeezed his hands. "Abel, you look as though you might fall over." "I might," he said honestly. He laughed a little, shaken and delighted. "A baby." "Yes," she said, "our baby." He put his forehead against hers and they stayed like that for a moment, just the two of them in the warm kitchen with the winter light coming through the window and the whole enormous future arranged before them. "I need to fix the back bedroom," he said. "You have 7 months," she said. "I should start today," he said. "Have your breakfast first," she said. And he sat back down and ate his breakfast with the slightly dazed expression of a man who has been presented with something so large, he has not quite finished taking its measure. She watched him across the table and felt the fullness of her life in a way that still surprised her sometimes. That she, Winifred Sawyer from Kentucky by way of Missouri by way of everywhere she had needed to be, had arrived at exactly this. Spring came again, her second spring on this land, and she knew it differently now. She knew where the first wildflowers came up on the hill above the creek, and she knew the way the light changed in the afternoons when the snow was still on the mountains but the valley was warm. And she knew the sound the cottonwoods made in the April wind, and the way the cattle moved when they were moved to the spring pasture with a satisfaction that was almost audible. She was larger with the baby now and she moved more slowly, and Abel watched her with a protectiveness that was constant and unobtrusive, always there but never smothering. He had, as promised, fixed the back bedroom, had built a proper cradle himself with a care and patience that produced something genuinely fine, smooth and sturdy and rocking perfectly level. She ran her hand over the cradle one evening while he watched from the doorway. "It is beautiful," she said. "It is practical," he said, because he found it harder to accept compliments about his own work than anyone else's. "Abel," she said, "it is beautiful." He looked at it. "It turned out reasonably," he conceded. She shook her head at him and he smiled. Cal Dunning's older sister, a midwife named Pearl who lived near Elko, came to stay at the ranch in late June in anticipation of the birth. She was a calm, experienced woman in her 40s who immediately put both Winifred and Abel at ease, not because she minimized what was ahead, but because she was so obviously competent that competence was itself reassuring. The baby came on a Thursday morning in late July, after a long labor that Winifred endured with the same quiet determination she brought to everything, and Abel sat on the porch through the night and the morning, alternating between productive ranch work and complete inability to do anything at all, until Pearl came to the door at mid-morning and told him he had a son. He had a son. He stood in the doorway of the bedroom and looked at Winifred in the bed, tired and flushed and absolutely herself, holding a small red-faced creature that was complaining about the world with great conviction, and something in Abel Shelby, some last remaining wall or reservation or protected inner place that had been there since he was 11 years old and his mother died, and he learned that the worst things could always happen, came down entirely. Winifred looked up and saw his face and held out her hand. He crossed the room and took her hand and looked at his son, who had dark hair and appeared, despite being approximately 2 hours old, to have strong opinions. "He is very loud," Abel said. "He gets it from you," Winifred said. "I am not loud," Abel said with some dignity. "Not with words," she said, "but you have opinions about everything. He has your opinions." She looked down at the baby and then back up at Abel with a smile so warm and direct it was like being walked into sunlight. "What will we call him?" Abel asked. "I thought," she said, "if you agreed we might call him James, for your father." Abel looked at her. His father had been James Shelby, a Georgia farmer who had worked all his life and lost everything in the war and who had, before he died of a chest ailment in Arkansas when Abel was 17, impressed upon his son the idea that land was the one thing a man built that could outlast him. "You remembered that," Abel said. "You told me about him," she said. "In December, Christmas Eve." He had told her things that night he had not told anyone in years. And she had been listening with the attentiveness she brought to everything that mattered. "James," he said. He looked at his son. "James Shelby." He said the name quietly, as if listening to how it sounded in the world. "Yes. That is right." James Shelby came into the world with the loud opinions of a man who knew what he wanted, and the three of them began the business of being a family in the back bedroom of the ranch house on Pinyon Creek while Pearl Dunning made coffee in the kitchen, and the summer outside went about its warm and ordinary business. In the weeks that followed the birth, the ranch found a new shape. Pearl stayed for a fortnight before returning to Elko, declaring James to be thriving and Winifred to be one of the most sensible new mothers she had attended in 20 years of midwifery, which was the highest compliment Pearl bestowed on anyone. Cal and Pete and Thomas were endlessly entertained by James, who returned their attention by being entirely indifferent to it and concerned primarily with eating and sleeping, and making his dissatisfaction known. Abel moved through the days with a quiet energy that was different from anything before, a purposefulness that had acquired a new depth, and Winifred watched him hold his son in the evenings and felt something so full and warm it was almost difficult to contain. She went back to the books within 3 weeks, working at the kitchen table with James in a basket nearby, and the accounts showed the same steady upward movement that they had been showing all year. The expanded herd was performing well. The North pasture was producing at the level she had projected. Thomas Alves had proven himself indispensable and was being paid accordingly. Vance Holloway made one more appearance in their lives near the end of the summer. A letter arrived from Henry Foss informing them that the territorial inquiry into the Nevada Land and Water Development Company had concluded, and that while no criminal charges had been brought, the company had been formally dissolved and its survey filings in the territory had been invalidated. Holloway himself had returned to California. Abel read the letter at the kitchen table with James asleep in the crook of his left arm and Winifred beside him. He put the letter down and looked at it for a moment. "It is done," he said. "It is done," she agreed. He looked at James, then at her. "I keep thinking about what you did," he said. "Those field notes, the evidence file, the letters to Foss. If you had not done all of that, Abel," she said. "I mean it," he said. "You saved this land, not just me. You did." She looked at him and felt the truth of it and the weight of it, because she had worked very hard and she did not see the value in pretending otherwise. "We saved it," she said. "Together." He nodded slowly. "Together," he said, and the word had the quality of something settled and permanent, something you build into the foundation. Autumn came the way it had the year before, with that beautiful copper light and the smell of coming cold and the mountains going white at the peaks. But it was entirely different from the year before, because now she was standing on her own porch looking at her own land with her son on her hip and her husband beside her, and the $43 sewn into the hem of her skirt was a memory that felt both very recent and very distant. She thought about the woman who had climbed off the stagecoach in Dust Creek with her chin up and her broken trunk and her determination, and she felt a tenderness toward that woman who had been so alone and so fierce about it. Abel came and stood beside her. He did not ask what she was thinking. He was patient that way, willing to wait for whatever she wanted to say. "I was thinking about the day I arrived," she said, "and the boy who tried to sell me a rabbit." Abel smiled. "What made you think of that?" "I was thinking about how far I have come from that morning," she said. She looked out at the valley. "I arrived with $43 and a broken trunk and a letter from a dead man, and I thought I was going to be a seamstress in a dry goods store, and instead I am here." "Instead you are here," he agreed. "I'm very glad I am here," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and James reached out one small determined hand and grabbed a handful of Abel's shirt collar and held it with great satisfaction. "I believe he has opinions about property rights," Abel said gravely. Winifred laughed, the bright real laugh that had first undone him back in December, and it rang out over the creek and the cottonwoods and the wide Nevada valley, and Abel held his family against the autumn wind and thought about his father, who had believed that land was the one thing a man built that could outlast him. His father had not been wrong exactly, but he had been incomplete. Land was one thing. But this, the woman beside him and the boy between them and the shared history of fights won, and worries endured and evenings at the kitchen table with the lamp burning, and the ledgers open and the cribbage board between them and the stories told, and the candlesticks taken down from the shelf where grief had kept them for too long. This was the thing that would outlast everything. The years went on, as years do on working land, with the rhythm of seasons and the steady accumulation of a life built carefully and well. The cattle herd was profitable. The north pasture performed every year as Winifred had predicted it would. Thomas Alves stayed on and became, in time, something more like a trusted partner than an employee. Jim and Susan Corbett remained their closest neighbors and friends, and on the first Sunday of each month they came for supper, or the Shelbys went to the Corbett ranch, and the conversations were long and easy and covered everything from cattle prices to politics to the best way to manage the creek pasture in a dry year. Susan and Winifred were as close as sisters, the kind of friendship that forms between women of similar intelligence and honesty who find themselves in the same corner of an enormous landscape. James grew from a loud, opinionated infant into a loud, opinionated child who wanted to be on a horse before he could properly walk, and who had his father's patience and his mother's precision, which was, everyone who knew them agreed, a formidable combination. When James was 3 years old, Winifred sat Abel down at the kitchen table and told him she was going to have another baby. He took the news this time with less dazed wonder and more quiet joy, though the wonder was still there underneath it. He kissed her forehead and went to check on the cradle, which had been stored in the barn, and which he brought in and sanded and refinished until it was as good as new. The second child was a boy too. They named him Robert, for no particular family obligation, but simply because it suited him, which Winifred determined from his first week of life on the somewhat mystical grounds that she always knew immediately what a thing was called. Abel, who had not been entirely convinced by this argument, admitted after 10 days that the child was unmistakably a Robert. Robert was quieter than James, more watchful, with Abel's dark eyes and something in his manner, even as an infant, that suggested he was taking very careful note of everything happening around him. James, at 3, took the arrival of his brother with the philosophical resignation of a child who has decided that new things are generally interesting until proven otherwise. The house on Pinyon Creek expanded, not in the haphazard way of necessity, but in the deliberate way of people who knew what they wanted and had the means to do it properly. Abel added a proper parlor to the east side of the house in the spring after Robert's birth, built with good timber and a stone fireplace that drew well. And in this parlor Winifred put the books that her cousin in Ohio had finally sent, arranged on the shelves that Abel had built the previous winter. And in the evenings the family gathered there, James with his small boots muddy from the yard, Robert in his basket, Abel reading or working on the accounts, Winifred with her mending or her correspondence. And the fire going and the lamp burning, and the sound of the wind outside that had stopped being lonely and become, instead, the sound of home. There was an evening in the autumn of what would have been Winifred's 4th year on the ranch, though by now the count did not feel like that. It simply felt like the years of her life as she lived it, when she was sitting on the porch after the boys were in bed and Abel came and sat beside her. The evening star was out. The creek made its small sound in the darkness. "Do you remember what I said to you?" Abel said. "That first day, in the saloon in Dusk Creek. You asked me what kind of work I could do," she said. "And you gave me that list," he said. "Sewing, bookkeeping, plain cooking, fancy cooking inadequately." "I have improved the fancy cooking considerably," she pointed out. "You have," he said. "You have improved more things than I can name." He was quiet for a moment. "I want you to know something." "Tell me," she said. "I was, at that time, a man who had a piece of land and a good herd and almost nothing else of substance," he said. "I had been building the practical parts of my life very carefully for years because I did not entirely know how to build the rest of it." She was listening very carefully, the way she listened to everything that mattered. "You came and built the rest of it," he said. "Not because you set out to, just by being exactly who you are." He looked at her. "I know I do not always say these things. I want to say them tonight." She looked at him for a long moment, this man who was not by nature given to many words and who had used his carefully to tell her something true. "I know," she said. "I have always known." "I thought you probably did," he said. "You are very perceptive." "Dangerously so," she agreed. He laughed and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him under the Nevada stars. And James Shelby, who was named for his grandfather, was sleeping soundly in his room. And Robert Shelby, who was unmistakably a Robert, was sleeping in his cradle. And the cattle were in the winter pasture, and the books were balanced, and the deed to this land was filed in 3 jurisdictions, and every document was in perfect order. And Holloway was in California, and the summer was over, and the year was turning. "Next spring," she said, "I want to plant an orchard, apple trees." "Apple trees," he said. "It will take years before they bear fruit," she said, "but it will be worth it." He considered this with his characteristic patience. "Where would you put them?" "On the south slope above the creek," she said. "The drainage is good there and it gets full sun in the afternoon." "You have already measured it," he said. "Obviously," she said. He shook his head with great affection. "All right," he said. "Apple trees in the spring." She smiled at the dark valley. Apple trees that would take years to bear fruit, planted in the south-facing soil of a ranch on Pinon Creek in Nevada, tended by a woman who had come west with $43 and a broken trunk and an unbroken determination, who had found what she was building toward and built it so well that it would stand long after both of them were gone. That was how love worked, she had come to understand. Not as a single moment or a single gesture, but as a long accumulation, a building of things both practical and fine, ledgers balanced and fences repaired, and candlesticks taken down from the shelf where grief had stored them and set back on the table where they belonged, in the light, in the warmth, in the company of the living. She was 28 years old. She was Winifred Shelby, formerly Sawyer, of Pinon Creek Ranch in the Nevada Territory. She had a husband who read by firelight and smiled rarely and meant everything he said, and 2 boys who were going to be a great deal of work and a great deal of joy, and an apple orchard that would fruit in 4 years and be magnificent in 10, and a life so full and so specifically hers that she could not have imagined it from the steps of that stagecoach 3.5 years ago. Abel looked at the same stars she was looking at, and she knew, because she knew him thoroughly by now, that he was thinking about his father and the land that outlasted things, and that he had extended his father's understanding of that to include everything they had built together, all of it part of the same enduring thing. "Come inside," she said. "It is getting cold." He stood and offered his hand, and she took it, and they went inside together out of the Nevada dark, into the light of the house they had made, and closed the door on the wind. The apple trees were planted in the spring, every one of them, 12 trees in a row on the south-facing slope above the creek, put in the ground by Abel and Winifred, and insofar as a 4-year-old could be said to help with anything, James, who was very clear about which holes he had dug and claimed several that he had not. Winifred tied a small marker at the base of each tree with a piece of cotton cloth, and in the evenings she went to check on them the way she checked on everything she was responsible for, with attention and steadiness, and the long view of a person who understood that good things take their own time. The trees grew slowly and surely, as apple trees do, putting down roots in the Nevada soil and finding the water that ran below the south slope, and reaching upward in the way of all living things toward the light that was reliably there. By the time Robert was walking and James was in the habit of bringing snakes into the house for educational purposes, and Abel had finished the new section of fence along the northern boundary, and Winifred had taught herself, from a book she had sent away for, enough about soil composition to improve the yield of the kitchen garden by 1/3, the apple trees were showing the first signs of that particular determination that precedes bearing, putting out long, sturdy branches and standing their ground against the mountain winters with a persistence that pleased her enormously. "They are going to be magnificent," she told Abel one evening. "You said that 4 years ago," he said. "I was right 4 years ago," she said. "You generally are," he said, which was his preferred form of agreement. She leaned on the fence above the orchard slope and looked at the trees in the spring light and thought about the patient arithmetic of good things, how they add up quietly over time into something larger than any of it seemed at the start. From behind her, she heard Robert announce, with great authority, that James had eaten the last of the cornbread. From further away, she heard James deny this with equal authority. Abel turned from the fence to adjudicate. She watched him go. This man who had been alone and solitary on his land for years, and who now navigated the cheerful chaos of 2 sons and a thriving ranch and a wife who kept the books and planted apple orchards and had very strong opinions about drainage. And she saw how entirely natural it all was to him now, how completely he had grown into it. He looked back at her over his shoulder just for a moment, and the look they exchanged was the shorthand of people who know each other deeply, full of everything they did not need to say because it was already understood between them. She smiled. He smiled back, the full, real smile. She turned once more to her apple trees, standing patient in their row on the south slope above the creek, under the wide Nevada sky that she had learned to call hers. In the life she had crossed a continent to find and built, with careful hands and a clear head and a heart that had known, since a December evening by lamplight when a man said her name like something he had thought about, that it had arrived at exactly the right place. This was Pinyon Creek. This was home. This was, in every measure that mattered, everything.